Hope you guys are having a great Thursday morning. We're going to be talking a bit about this. I don't know if you call it a civil war, a new civil war within the Democratic Party. There seem to be a lot of different divisions that are tearing the party apart. And this one in particular stems from a remark that Joe Biden made in a closed door setting about reaching. I don't think it's called reaching across the aisle, but civility was what happened. So Joe Biden on Wednesday doubled down on his statements about working with segregationist senators, telling reporters that he has nothing to be sorry for. Biden dismissed criticism of the comments, including from fellow Democratic presidential candidates such as Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, who called on Biden to apologize. Apologize for what? Cory should apologize, Biden said. He knows better. There's not a racist bone in my body. So here, let's listen to what Nancy Pelosi said. I actually haven't heard it, so that'll be kind of interesting.
I know you have no favorites in this race, but is it a mistake for Joe Biden to talk about working across the aisle with segregationists in the past? Is that the wrong message for voters today?
What I think is most important for all the candidates is authenticity. They are who they are. They've lived a life, and they have grown from their experiences, and I think that's what he's trying to tell us. So I have no criticism of what he believes is his story to tell the American people, that he will work with anyone to get a good result for the American people.
So that's a very Weasley answer, and I'll tell you why. That he'll work with anyone. This is the same thing that they criticize none other than Trump for, that he's willing to work with Kim Jong-un in order to resolve the nuclear crisis, that he's willing to, he wants to work with Putin. They're not really letting him because the Dems are all about Orange Man bad. And they just have this objection every time he reaches out to someone that they seem to think is all yucky and awful.
In your reaction to the Trump kickoff in Florida, where he was calling out Hillary Clinton at least 7 times and going on about the Democrats and the so-called witch hunt?
Well, nothing is new. We've seen this act before, and we have to make sure that the public sees the sharp contrast between getting something done. There's one word that I would use to describe him now, after hearing that yesterday, is ineffective. I've always known he's been ineffective, but he continues to have nothing to talk about, how he's going to make things better for the future, how he can work across the aisle to get things done for the good of the American people. So I think I'd start, I've been using the word criminal, but I think one that might be more persuasive to people is he's a totally ineffective president.
Any advice for the candidates going into the debates next week?
I just say the best advice I ever got is what I always give. Be yourself. Show your why.
Yeah, so I think anyone trying to do well should probably, not heed any advice for Nancy Pelosi, even that which is one of the most ridiculous platitudes that there is. No. The whole notion that Joe Biden was being authentic by citing this issue of having worked across the divide within the party with segregationists is ridiculous. Either you believe that segregation was wrong, or you didn't, or you might have been a segregationist. And there was a time, and it was not that long ago, when a lot of people, and there still are people like that, and they have voting rights too, that believe that there should be separation of people in public facilities by race. Okay, I happen to disagree with them, but at the time Joe Biden was a senator, this was a big issue, and there was a major divide in the country, and he happened to think, well, I guess it wasn't so bad to work along with these people. So it says the former vice president cited his past voting record and his work on the Voting Rights Act while head of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Biden claimed he didn't have to like someone else's views to make his case and beat them. I've been involved in civil rights my whole career, Biden continued before walking away to a fundraiser in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is one of the richest parts of the Metro D.C. area. Period. In an interview Wednesday night on CNN, Booker, who is African American, said he was surprised that Biden didn't apologize. For someone to show the lack of understanding or sensitivity to even know when they've made a mistake, and to fall into that kind of defensive posture that I should apologize to him is really problematic, he said. That sounds like something Cory Booker would say. I was raised to speak truth to power, he said, and I will never apologize for doing that. And Vice President Biden shouldn't need this lesson. The back and forth began on Tuesday when Biden recalled, so this is where it stems from. He recalled the civility of the Senate in the 1970s and 80s, touting his experience working with two segregationist Southern senators to get, quote, things done, unleashing a torrent of criticism from his Democratic rivals, some of whom denounced the comments in very personal terms by citing their own race. Speaking at a fundraiser at New York City's Carlisle Hotel, again, going and talking to very rich people in very ritzy locations, Joe Biden brought up the names of Senators James Eastland of Mississippi and Herman Talmadge of Georgia, both Democrats who were staunchly opposed to desegregation. Eastland chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee when Biden entered the Senate, a committee he would later chair. He says, I was in a caucus with James O. Eastland, the former vice president said. He never called me boy. He always called me son. Of Talmadge, Biden said he was one of the meanest guys I ever knew. You go down the list of all these guys, at least there was some civility, Biden added. We got things done. We didn't agree on much of anything. We got things done. We got finished. But today you look at the other side and you're the enemy, not the opposition, the enemy. We don't talk to each other anymore. So what I find very funny about this entire situation is he didn't say what he got done. And the fact is that if you're talking about legislation that is associated with civil rights, that's not what you got done with James Eastland or with Herman Talmadge. And if you look at these people, so James Eastland, for him to bring him up, it says here that he has been called the voice of the white South and the godfather of Mississippi politics. A Dixiecrat, Eastland was known as the symbol of Southern resistance to racial integration during the Civil Rights era, often speaking of blacks as, quote, an inferior race. Let's just look at some of these things that he said. When the Supreme Court issued its decision in the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, ruling that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, Eastland, like most Southern Democrats, denounced it in a speech he given in Senatobia, Mississippi on August 12, 1955. He announced on May 17, 1954, the Constitution of the United States was destroyed because of the Supreme Court's decision. You are not obliged to obey the decisions of any court which are plainly fraudulent sociological considerations. So he was telling people to violate court orders by the Supreme Court to desegregate schools, because the fact of the matter is that, look, I know some people will say, well, come on, I mean, you're supposed to be a constitutional conservative. Isn't it true that you would stand that the Supreme Court shouldn't legislate from the bench? But that's exactly what had happened with Plessy versus Ferguson. The concept of segregation, of discrimination by race, was, in a certain sense, government interference. That's how Plessy versus Ferguson happened, which is what allowed these states and cities and localities to segregate schools. So what Eastland was doing was effectively bitching that the Supreme Court had ruined something that they had imposed in the first place, segregation. Eastland would become actively involved with the White Citizens Council, an organization which boasted 60,000 members across the South and was called the new clan that enforces thought control by economic pressures. Eastland testified to the Senate 10 days after the Brown decision, and he says the Southern institution of racial segregation or racial separation was the correct self-evident truth which arose from the chaos and confusion of the Reconstruction period. Separation promotes racial harmony. It permits each race to follow its own pursuits and its own civilization. Segregation is not discrimination, Mr. President. It is the law of nature. It is the law of God that every race has. So I'm not going to keep reading. I think it's pretty ridiculous what he's saying, because no, in many senses, the segregation of the two races did not allow the black people in the South to pursue their own pursuits. And look, the South was backward also for white people at the time. So this idea that life was better under segregation is, I would say, it's a little fallacious. I wouldn't say everything was worse back there. Back then, obviously, some people, even people in the black community, I've heard some of their businesses were a little easier to market because you could get a lot more people who didn't have a choice. A lot of black people didn't have a choice. They would have to go to the black hotel. They would have to go to the black restaurant, the black garage in some cases. But if you're talking about society as a whole, it doesn't really help. You have a patchwork of racial cantons where one group gets all the services in one area and the other people in another, and it's just something that doesn't make any sense. So this is the type of person that Biden was saying, oh, we got along with them and we could be civil. Herman Talmadge, apparently, it says here that he was a staunch anti-desegregationist or anti-integrationist. He boycotted the 1964 Democratic National Convention, which is where the Democrats adopted the civil rights platform. And there were many other people within. Now he could have talked about a number of other segregationists at the time, because when he was still in the Senate, when he was in the Senate in the early 70s, there were still people there like John Stennis, who I think was the other senator from Mississippi. And then you had people like William Fulbright, who was Bill Clinton's mentor, who was the senator from Arkansas. These people were hardcore segregationists, and they never renounced their views. And nobody's ever taken the Democrats who came out of that era, Al Gore and Bill Clinton, to task for being part of that group, because they simply, they merged into the rest of the Democratic Party. They never officially, there was no transition. There's the whole notion that there was a party switch in the late 60s and early 70s, where the Republicans and Democrats changed their stances on racial issues. But it's not accurate, because the whole idea that the Republicans suddenly became racist is not borne out, because in terms of enforcing actual de jure segregation using law, the Republicans never attempted to do it. They never attempted to reinforce issues like the poll tax, or I don't think that they have, at least. So if I'm wrong about that, you can let me know in the comments. They never attempted to reinforce actual legal segregation in the country, which is really what it was about. It's not about telling people that you have to have literally everywhere, everything has to be integrated no matter what. But it is about saying that any institution that is owned by the public, schools, hospitals, and if you're talking about, county hospitals, for example, those things cannot be segregated. They can't be, or you can't have one ward for one group of people and another ward for another. That was the difference. The Democrats, before the so-called switch, were in favor of that segregation. The Republicans were never in favor of it, not before or not after. It's the simple fact is that as time went by, more of the segregationist Democrats passed away or retired or whatever, and that sort of attitude fell apart, and you were left with a more broad consensus that was pro-civil rights. Yes, there were a couple pretty racist Republicans, that including Jesse Helms of North Carolina and Strom Thurmond, who had been a Democrat before, of South Carolina. So Biden is not apologizing for this. I think it's very funny to see people think that, well, the media can just bully him into renouncing his entire career, because, he did go and flip on the Hyde Amendment. He did go and flip on a number of other issues, but he hasn't flipped yet, so far as I know, about the Clinton crime bill or about this. So he said, At a Maryland fundraiser Wednesday night, Biden told donors he detested the segregationist stances of Eastland and Talmadge. He said he and Senator Ted Kennedy, had to put up with the likes of Jim Eastland and Hermie Talmadge and all those segregationists and all that. And the fact of the matter is that we were able to do it because we were able to win and we were able to beat them on everything they stood for. We, in fact, detested what they stood for in terms of segregation and all the rest. Booker was the first to call on Biden to apologize. You don't joke about calling black men, quote, boys. Men like James O. Eastland used words like that and the racist policies that accompanied them to perpetuate white supremacy and strip black Americans of our very humanity. Booker said in a statement. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio, also presidential contender, struck back on Twitter, and he just posted a pic of him and his wife is black. She also used to be gay, apparently, and then he wrote this very, very graphic couple lines. And he said, Eastland thought my multiracial family should be illegal and that whites were entitled to the pursuit of dead N-words. Wednesday, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris, both presidential contenders, also responded to Biden's comments, saying, I'm not here to criticize other Democrats, but it's never okay to celebrate segregationists, Warren said, never. Harris said she was deeply concerned about Biden's remarks. If those men had their way, I wouldn't be in the United States Senate and on this elevator right now. She added, on the campaign trail, Biden, who has previously mentioned both Eastland and Talmadge in appearances. So this isn't even the first time. He loves talking about these idiots. Here he is at the gay bar. Cautions against those who believe it's not worth the time to even try and persuade those across the aisle or with lawmakers who have morally different views on divisive issues. The former vice president has made working across the aisle a central theme of his message early in the presidential campaign, deferring from many of his top-tier Democratic rivals. He cited senators like Eastland and Talmadge to highlight that although he disagreed with them on civil rights, he was still willing to work with them. Look, this is one of the most ridiculous things I've heard. Here's Simone Sanders, a.k.a. King Hippo, saying, was at the forefront of marriage equality before it was politically popular. The man who served as President Obama's VP, the man who literally launched his 2020 campaign calling out Nazis in Charlottesville along with Trump's equivalency, suggesting he is actively praising a segregationist is just a bad take and a woefully just disingenuous take. Well, the fact of the matter is that he was lying about Charlottesville too. So we don't have to take his word for anything. We don't have to take yours either, you weird freak. I don't feel sorry for Joe Biden. And I want to state this. The reason that Joe Biden should probably answer his own question about the lack of civility is that he's partially responsible for the lack of civility. He led the Senate Judiciary Committee during the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings, and that was when the Democrats were generally trying to get enough mud to stick to Thomas to get him withdrawn from the bench, and Thomas would have been the first, and he is the first black SCOTUS pick since Thurgood Marshall. I don't think there has been one since then, and not that that's the reason to put him on the court, but the fact is that I've talked to people. I actually asked somebody. I don't know how this came up. Maybe it was just me wondering. I asked somebody what his perception of it was at the time, and he said, well, as a liberal at the time in the 90s, he thought, because I was only 6 years old, he thought that Thomas was obviously guilty. There's no way that he was not guilty. But with time, he realized that it had all been a pack of lies, and there was actually no substance or evidence behind what Anita Hill was saying. So I think a lot of people with time have realized that the spirit of that era is what really ruined the Senate, as Joe Biden is lamenting. It's the same thing that they did to Robert Bork. They ended up going through his video rental history. So yeah, the Democrats, I would say, look, I don't think the Republican Party is that good. You see, this is Justice Kavanaugh. I didn't think he was a great nominee, but what they did to go after him, what they did to go after Robert Bork at the time, what they did to go after Clarence Thomas was basically a witch hunt. And in this case, you had a Democratic staffer, Jackson Costco, who hacked into. He didn't hack into, but he broke. He literally broke into the office of his former boss, Senator Maggie Hassan, and he was at the time working for a new boss, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas, and he retrieved the personal info of a number of Republican senators, Mike Lee, Rand Paul, Mitch McConnell, a couple other people. I think Orrin Hatch, and he disseminated them. He doxed them, and it was the spirit of the Kavanaugh hearings is really something that Joe Biden should realize. That was the Democrats who did that. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump. Donald Trump simply picked Kavanaugh, and he wanted it to go through. The fact that they started to make this whole ruckus about Christine Blasey Ford and her ridiculous story and the two doors and all of that and the fear of flying, that was the Democrats making society less civil. This guy who's pleaded guilty now, he hacked into his former boss's office, so he was willing to try to blackmail his former boss, who was a Democrat herself, and then he himself was hooked up with people like Dianne Feinstein of California and Nancy Pelosi. That's how he had gotten the job, and he was basically willing to risk it all in order to bring down Kavanaugh and also dox all of these senators. And that was the whole point, that he was trying to get enough public pressure on them to the degree that he was going to reveal where they lived, what their personal phone numbers, in order to get Kavanaugh not to be confirmed to the bench. And that's how things like this backfired. By the way, there was a second person who has apparently been implicated in it, Samantha DeForest Harris, who let him into the office. And he also apparently put these keylogger devices in there so that people who pass by with their Wi-Fi could see the keystrokes and therefore the passwords and certain confidential information or even classified information that these senators were typing or their aides were typing. They could just get it uploaded to their phone. So this is effectively espionage. So I don't know why Joe Biden is harking back to a time of civility. People on the left, I acknowledge that there are people on the right who are not really civil. And I think that the fact is people have to police their own behavior, and if they did, society wouldn't have to do it for them. The fact is that there are things like police overreach and things like that, but generally you'd have to acknowledge that when there's domestic violence going on, when there's issues of alcoholism, minors getting drugged up, things like that. Well, you do need courts to get involved sometimes in order to mandate certain things. But the left, I would say, is generally the more violent, the more hostile group. Sometimes you might think, well, how come we don't hear more about it? Well, I said that they're more violent and hostile, but they're also sometimes more incompetent. These were people who in Cleveland in 2012, they attempted to blow up the 480 bridge, which links the west and east sides of the city. And they've been convicted. And they later claimed, well, we were really entrapped. We weren't really that serious about it, but somebody came and said that they'd offered to help us. Look, the fact is that a lot of these people thought it would be a good idea. Okay, I think that legally there's a lot of questions about it. There have been some people who have brought up the idea that this might have never happened if somebody had placed this idea in their head. It doesn't matter. These people were radicalized to the degree that they would take violent steps to ensure a new revolution. And that's really the problem with people on the left. And it goes all the way from the left side of the spectrum to close to the center. I don't know if I would count Joe Biden, but I'd say, he's done plenty by cooperating with the Obama administration, an administration responsible for so many problems, the drone striking, supporting the Arab Spring, sending weapons to Al-Qaeda in the Middle East. there are people from all across the left who are willing to engage in violence or support acts of violence in order to achieve certain means. That doesn't mean that there's nobody on the right that does that. I'm not letting them off the hook either. But that's really the origin of the lack of civility in the Senate and in politics that Joe Biden is for some reason complaining about. That's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also, subscribe to me on BitChute and on Minds, as well as donate on Subscribestar. Those you can all find me at Chef Leopard, and also on Gab at Starscream85 and on Parler at Razor Ray. And I'll talk to you later.